The scream that tore from Sarah Mitchell's throat in the summer of 1876 was not one of birthing pain, but of a grief so profound it seemed to shake the very foundations of the small ranch house outside Abilene Shores, Kansas. Dr. Holloway withdrew his hands, his weathered face etched with sorrow as he looked down at the tiny, still form wrapped in white linen, the third child Sarah had carried to term only to lose within hours of delivery. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 8 months now, trampled by a spooked horse during a cattle drive, and Sarah had clung to this pregnancy like a lifeline, believing that God would grant her this one mercy after taking so much. But the baby boy, born too early and too weak, had drawn only a handful of shallow breaths before falling silent in her arms. The doctor murmured his condolences, speaking of lung development in Providence, but Sarah heard none of it. She turned her face to the wall, her body shaking with silent sobs that seemed to have no end. The ranch hand who had ridden to fetch the doctor now stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in his weathered hands. Cole Harrison had worked for the Mitchell Ranch for only 3 months, hired on after Thomas's death to help Sarah keep the property running. He was a man of 26 years, tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that fell across his forehead. He had seen death before, had watched men die on battlefields during the war and on dusty trails where the unforgiving West claimed lives without warning. But this was different. This was a woman who had already buried 2 babies before this one, a woman who had lost her husband and now her last hope for family, and something in Cole's chest tightened painfully at the sound of her broken weeping. Dr. Holloway gathered his instruments with quiet efficiency, wrapping the small body with gentle hands. "Someone should sit with her," he said quietly to Cole. "She should not be alone right now. Grief like this can break a person's mind as surely as it breaks their heart." Cole nodded, though he felt entirely inadequate to the task. He was a drifter, a man who had never stayed in one place long enough to form attachments, who had learned early that caring too deeply only led to pain. But as the doctor left and the other ranch hands shuffled away, unable to face such raw sorrow, Cole found himself crossing the threshold into Sarah's bedroom. She lay curled on her side, her brown hair matted with sweat against her pale face, her hands clutched against her empty stomach. The midday sun filtered through the thin curtains, casting golden light across the worn floorboards. Cole approached slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal, and carefully pulled a chair close to her bedside. He did not speak, did not offer empty platitudes about God's plan or better days ahead. Instead, he simply reached out and took her hand in his calloused palm, holding it with a gentleness that surprised even himself. Sarah's fingers twitched in his grasp, and for a long moment she did not acknowledge his presence, but then her hand tightened around his, gripping with desperate strength, and a fresh wave of sobs shook her frame. Cole held on, his thumb stroking slowly across her knuckles, and he found his own eyes burning with unshed tears. He had not known this woman well, had spoken to her only about ranch business and daily tasks, but in this moment he felt her pain as if it were his own, and something fundamental shifted in his chest. Hours passed. The sun tracked across the sky, painting the room in shades of amber and rose. Sarah's sobs eventually quieted to exhausted whimpers, and still Cole sat beside her bed, holding her hand. Other ranch hands came to the door, asking in hushed voices what needed to be done, and Cole gave quiet instructions about the livestock and the evening chores without releasing Sarah's grip. When darkness finally fell and lantern light replaced the sun, Sarah's voice emerged, hoarse and broken. "I prayed," she whispered. "I prayed so hard. I begged God to let me keep just one baby to hold, to raise, to love. But he took them all. He took Thomas. He took my babies, and I have nothing left. Nothing." Cole swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You are here," he said quietly. "That is something." "Is it?" Sarah's eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, turned to him. "What purpose do I serve now? I am a woman who cannot bear living children, A widow with a failing ranch, a person God has turned his face from. Tell me, Mr. Harrison, what is the value of such an existence? The rawness of her despair cut him to the bone. Cole had never been a religious man, had seen too much senseless death to believe in a benevolent deity watching over mankind. But he also knew that telling her his doubts would bring no comfort. Instead, he tightened his grip on her hand and leaned forward, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The value is in every sunrise you see, every breath you take, every moment you choose to keep living despite the pain, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I do not know why bad things happen to good people, Mrs. Mitchell. I do not have answers about God or fate or why the world is so cruel. But I know that you are strong, stronger than you believe right now. And I know that giving up would be the real tragedy. Your babies lived, even if only for short times. They were real. They mattered. And you loved them. That love does not disappear just because they are gone. Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears, but these were different, softer somehow. You are speaking as though you understand, she whispered. Have you lost someone? Cole's jaw tightened, memories flickering across his mind like shadows. I lost everyone, he said simply. My parents to fever, my brother to the war. The woman I thought I would marry to another man when I came back with nothing to offer her. I learned that loss is part of living, and living means finding reasons to keep going even when it seems impossible. They sat in silence for a long while after that, hands still clasped, and something unspoken passed between them. A understanding, perhaps, or a recognition of shared pain. When Sarah finally fell into an exhausted sleep, Cole carefully released her hand and stood, his muscles stiff from sitting so long. He moved to the doorway but paused, looking back at the woman who looked so small and fragile in the large bed. Something in his chest ached, a feeling he could not quite name, and he realized that for the first time in years he wanted to stay somewhere, wanted to help someone beyond simple obligation. The funeral was held 2 days later in the small cemetery on the edge of the Mitchell property, where 2 tiny graves already marked the resting places of Sarah's first 2 children. The sky was a brilliant blue, mockingly beautiful, and a handful of neighbors gathered to pay their respects. Sarah stood beside the fresh grave in a black dress that hung loose on her frame, her face pale and expressionless. Cole stood slightly behind her, close enough that his presence was felt but not intrusive, and when the preacher began speaking about God's mysterious ways and heavenly reunion, Sarah's legs buckled. Cole caught her instantly, his arm wrapping around her waist to support her weight. She did not faint, but she leaned against him heavily, as though all the strength had drained from her body. The preacher continued his sermon, but Cole heard none of it. He was focused entirely on the woman in his arms, on keeping her upright, on being the solid presence she desperately needed. After the burial, the neighbors offered their condolences with awkward pats and murmured sympathies before departing, clearly uncomfortable with such profound grief. Sarah walked back to the house mechanically, Cole at her side, and when they reached the porch, she stopped suddenly. I cannot go in there, she said, her voice flat. I cannot walk into that house where I heard him cry those few small cries before he stopped. I cannot face the cradle Thomas built, the blankets I sewed, all the hope I foolishly allowed myself to feel. Cole understood. He had felt that way about places where happiness had died, where ghosts of better times lingered to torment the living. Without thinking, he took her hand again, that gesture that had become natural between them, and led her away from the house, across the yard to the barn. Inside, the air was warm and sweet with hay, and the horses nickered softly in their stalls. Cole guided Sarah to a pile of hay bales and sat beside her, their shoulders touching. When my brother died, Cole said quietly, I could not go home for 2 years. Every corner of our family farm reminded me of him, of all the plans we had made, all the dreams that died with him on that battlefield. I drifted from place to place working any job I could find, never staying long because staying meant feeling and feeling hurt too much. What changed? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Time, Cole admitted, and eventually realizing that running from pain just meant carrying it with me everywhere I went. The memories were going to be there whether I faced them or not. At least if I stopped running, I could decide what to do with them. Sarah was quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on a shaft of sunlight streaming through a gap in the barn walls. My faith is gone, she finally said. I believed in a loving God, in divine purpose, in the idea that righteousness and prayer mattered. But what kind of God takes 3 innocent babies from a woman who wanted nothing more than to love them? What kind of God leaves me alone in this world with nothing but grief and unanswered questions? Cole could hear the depth of betrayal in her voice, the way her faith's destruction cut as deeply as the loss of her children. He chose his words carefully, knowing that this moment mattered, that what he said could either help or harm her healing. Maybe God did not take them, he said slowly. Maybe the world is just hard and bodies are fragile, and sometimes terrible things happen for no reason at all. Maybe faith is not about believing God will prevent suffering, but about believing you can survive it when it comes. Sarah turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time since the birth. She saw the lines around his eyes that spoke of his own hardships, the set of his jaw that showed determination tempered by sorrow, the genuine compassion in his gaze. Why do you care? She asked. You barely know me. You could have left after the funeral, found work elsewhere, avoided all of this pain. Why are you still here? It was a fair question, and one Cole had been asking himself. He thought about the easy answer, about wages owed and professional obligation, but those were lies. The truth was more complicated and infinitely more terrifying. Because when I held your hand that first day, something in me recognized something in you, he said, his voice low and honest. Because I have been alone for so long and I am tired of drifting. Because you matter, Mrs. Mitchell. Even if you cannot see it right now, your pain matters, your survival matters, and I want to be here to see you come through this to the other side. Sarah's breath hitched, and for the first time since the loss, something other than grief flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the faintest spark of connection. She did not pull away when Cole's hand found hers again, and they sat in the barn until the sun began to set, finding comfort in shared silence and the gentle companionship of 2 wounded souls. The days that followed were difficult. Sarah moved through the house like a ghost, performing necessary tasks with mechanical precision, but showing no real engagement with life. She prepared meals but barely ate, tended to household chores but took no pride in them, and often Cole would find her standing motionless, staring at nothing, lost in the labyrinth of her grief. The other ranch hands grew uncomfortable with her sorrow, and one by one they made excuses and left, finding work on neighboring spreads where death did not hang so heavy in the air. But Cole stayed. He took over the bulk of the ranch work, rising before dawn to feed livestock, mend fences, and manage the small herd of cattle Thomas Mitchell had built over the years. He hired a few day workers when the labor proved too much for one man, paying them from his own wages when Sarah seemed incapable of managing the ranch finances. In the evenings, he would return to the house and coax Sarah into eating something, sitting across from her at the worn kitchen table and talking about inconsequential things, trying to draw her back to the world of the living. 3 weeks after the funeral, Cole found Sarah in the nursery Thomas had built off the main bedroom. She sat in the rocking chair, holding the tiny blanket she had embroidered with careful stitches, her face wet with silent tears. Cole's heart clenched at the sight, and he moved into the room without hesitation, kneeling beside the chair. "Tell me about them," he said gently. "Tell me about your babies." Sarah looked startled, as though no one had ever asked her to speak of her lost children as real people rather than tragic footnotes. Her fingers tightened on the blanket, and slowly, haltingly, she began to talk. "The first was a girl," she said, her voice trembling. We named her Margaret, after Thomas's mother. She lived for 3 days, and she had the tiniest fingers, perfect little nails like seashells. She would grip my finger when I fed her, and I thought she was getting stronger, but then she just faded. The doctor said her heart was weak, that there was nothing to be done. Cole listened, his hand resting gently on the arm of the rocking chair, his presence steady and encouraging. The second was a boy, Daniel. He was stillborn. I carried him for 9 months, felt him move inside me, talked to him and sang to him, and then when the time came, he was already gone. They said the cord had wrapped around his neck. I never even heard him cry. Sarah's voice broke, but she continued, needing to speak these truths aloud. And the third, my last baby, I called him James in my heart, even though we never had time for a proper naming. He was so small, born too early, and he struggled so hard to breathe. I held him against my chest, trying to give him my warmth, my strength, but it was not enough. Nothing I did was ever enough. Tears streamed down Cole's own face now, and he reached up to take both of Sarah's hands in his. You did everything right, he said fiercely. You loved them, you tried, you gave them everything you had. Their deaths are not your fault, Sarah. You are not a failure. You are a mother who lost her children, and that is a tragedy. But it does not define your worth. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it seemed to break something open in Sarah. She slid from the rocking chair and into Cole's arms, burying her face against his shoulder and sobbing with a rawness that shook them both. Cole held her tightly, one hand cradling her head, the other wrapped around her back, and he let her cry out all the poison grief that had been festering in her heart. They stayed that way for a long time, tangled together on the nursery floor, and when Sarah's sobs finally quieted, she did not pull away. Instead, she rested her forehead against Cole's chest, exhausted but somehow lighter, as though speaking her children's names and stories aloud had released some of the crushing weight she carried. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me remember them as people, not just as losses." Cole's hand stroked slowly through her hair, the gesture soothing and tender. "They were people," he said quietly. "They were loved, and they mattered, and you will carry them in your heart for the rest of your life. But Sarah, you have to keep living, not for them, not for Thomas's memory, but for yourself. You have to choose to survive this." Sarah pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his face. "I do not know if I'm strong enough," she admitted. "You are," Cole said with absolute certainty. "I've watched you these past weeks, and I have seen your strength even when you cannot. You get up every morning even though it hurts. You keep breathing even though you want to give up. That is courage, Sarah. That is the bravest thing a person can do." Something shifted in Sarah's expression, a softening, a recognition. She reached up tentatively and touched Cole's face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You are a good man, Cole Harrison," she said softly. "Better than I deserve right now." "You deserve kindness," Cole replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You deserve support and compassion, and someone who sees your worth even when you have forgotten it." They rose from the floor together, and Cole helped Sarah close the nursery door with gentle finality. It was not about forgetting, but about allowing herself to step away from the shrine of grief, to rejoin the world outside that one room. They walked to the kitchen together, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah ate a full meal, while Cole told her stories about his travels, about the characters he had met in cattle towns and mining camps, about the beauty and harshness of the untamed West. Sarah found herself laughing at one of his tales, a small, rusty sound that seemed to surprise them both. It felt strange, almost wrong, to experience even a moment of levity when her heart was still so heavy. But Cole's answering smile was so warm, so genuinely pleased to see that spark of life in her, that Sarah allowed herself to relax into the moment. As summer gave way to autumn, a gradual transformation occurred. Sarah began to engage more with the ranch, walking the property with Cole, and learning about the work he had been doing to keep everything running. She discovered that he had been paying several expenses out of his own pocket, and when she confronted him about it, he simply shrugged and said he wanted to help. The simple generosity of it, the lack of expectation or demand for repayment, moved Sarah deeply. She also began to notice Cole in ways that had nothing to do with grief or gratitude. The way his shoulders filled out his work shirt, the sound of his laughter when one of the horses nuzzled him affectionately, the gentleness of his hands when he helped a mare through a difficult birth. He was patient and kind, strong but never harsh, and Sarah found her eyes following him as he moved around the ranch, her heart beating faster when he smiled at her. Cole was equally aware of Sarah, though he tried to keep his feelings carefully controlled. She was a widow in mourning, vulnerable and hurt, and he would not take advantage of her grief. But he could not help noticing the way the autumn sun caught the auburn highlights in her brown hair, the grace of her movements as she regained her strength, the increasing warmth in her eyes when she looked at him. He found himself thinking about her constantly, imagining a future that seemed both impossible and desperately desired. One evening in late October, they sat together on the porch as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and crimson. Sarah had been quiet all day, thoughtful, and Cole had learned to read her moods well enough to know she was working through something important. "Cole," she said finally, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. "I need to tell you something." He turned to face her, giving her his full attention. "I am listening." Sarah took a deep breath, her hands folded in her lap. "I have been thinking about faith, about what you said that day in the barn, about how faith might not be about expecting God to prevent suffering, but about believing you can survive it." Cole waited, sensing she had more to say. "I do not think my faith will ever be what it was," Sarah continued. "I cannot go back to that simple belief that everything happens for a reason, that God has a plan, and all will be well if I just pray hard enough. That innocence is gone, shattered as completely as glass dropped on stone." She paused, her eyes distant, then refocused on Cole with an intensity that made his breath catch. "But I am beginning to find a different kind of faith," she said quietly. "Faith in the kindness of good people. Faith in the possibility of healing even when the wounds seem fatal. Faith that maybe love can bloom even in the hardest soil, if someone patient enough tends it." Cole's heart was pounding now, hope and fear warring in his chest. "Sarah, what are you saying?" She reached out and took his hand, that gesture that had become their anchor through the storm of grief. "I am saying that you saved my life, Cole Harrison. Not dramatically, not with some grand gesture, but day by day, moment by moment, by simply refusing to let me drown. And somewhere in the midst of all that darkness, I have found myself caring for you in ways that terrify and exhilarate me." Cole's throat was tight with emotion, and he had to swallow hard before he could speak. "I have loved you since that first day," he admitted, his voice raw and honest. "Since I held your hand and felt your pain, and knew I would do anything to help you carry it. I have been trying to hold back, trying to give you space and time, trying not to burden you with feelings you might not be ready for. But Sarah, I love you. I love your strength and your compassion and your fierce heart. I want to spend my life making you smile, giving you reasons to keep choosing to live." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, but they were different tears now, tears of overwhelmed emotion rather than pure grief. "I am still broken," she warned. "I still have days when the pain is so heavy I can barely move. I still mourn my babies and probably always will. I do not know if I can ever try to have another child, if I could survive losing one more." "Then we will not," Cole said immediately, cupping her face in his hands. "We will build a life that is complete just as we are. Two people who found each other in the darkness and chose to walk toward the light together. I do not need children to be happy, Sarah. I need you. I need to wake up beside you and work alongside you and fall asleep knowing you are safe and loved. Everything else is just details." Sarah let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then she leaned forward and kissed him. It was tentative at first, questioning, but when Cole responded with tender passion, she deepened the kiss, pouring all her complicated feelings into the connection. Relief and desire and gratitude and love all tangled together, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Is this real?" Sarah whispered. "Can this possibly work?" "It is as real as you want it to be," Cole replied, his forehead resting against hers. "I am not going anywhere, Sarah. I am choosing you, choosing this, choosing us, every day for as long as you will have me." "Forever then," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "I choose forever." They married in December, a quiet ceremony in the parlor of the ranch house with only a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple blue dress rather than white, a conscious choice that acknowledged her past while embracing her future. Cole wore his best suit, his hands trembling slightly as he slid a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger. The preacher who had buried Sarah's babies looked surprised but pleased to be officiating a wedding instead, and he kept the ceremony short and focused on hope and new beginnings. That night, as snow began to fall softly outside the window, Cole and Sarah came together as husband and wife. Their lovemaking was tender and unhurried, filled with whispered assurances and gentle exploration. Cole was patient and attentive, making sure Sarah felt cherished and safe. And when she cried afterward, he simply held her and understood that these were healing tears, necessary and cleansing. "I never thought I would feel this way again," Sarah admitted, curled against Cole's chest in the darkness. "Happy, I mean. Hopeful about the future. After everything that happened, I thought joy was something that would always be beyond my reach." Cole kissed her forehead, his arms tightening around her. "Joy comes in unexpected ways," he said quietly, "sometimes from the most unlikely places. I'd given up on the idea of home, of belonging somewhere and to someone. Then I found you, and suddenly I understood what people meant when they talked about coming home." Sarah tilted her face up to kiss him softly. "You are my home too," she whispered, "my safe harbor in the storm." They fell asleep tangled together, and for the first time since losing James, Sarah slept through the night without nightmares. The winter was harsh that year, with deep snows and bitter cold that kept them housebound for days at a time, but the enforced closeness only strengthened their bond. They talked for hours, sharing stories from their pasts, their fears and dreams, their philosophies about life and death and everything in between. Cole taught Sarah to play poker, and she taught him to bake bread. They read aloud to each other from the few books in the house, acted out silly scenarios to make each other laugh, and made love with increasing confidence and passion. Sarah had good days and bad days. Sometimes she would wake up crying, overwhelmed by memories of her lost children, and Cole would hold her until the storm passed. Other times she would grow quiet and withdrawn, and Cole learned to give her space while staying close enough that she knew she was not alone. Slowly, gradually, the bad days became less frequent, and the good days began to outnumber them. Spring arrived with a rush of wildflowers and new life. The cattle had calved successfully, adding to the herd, and the ranch finances began to stabilize under their combined management. Sarah proved to have a good head for numbers, and together she and Cole made plans for expanding the operation, buying more land, building a future that felt solid and real. One warm April evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah broached a subject that had been on her mind for weeks. "Cole, I have been thinking about something," she said carefully, "and I need to know your honest feelings about it." He turned to her, attentive. "Of course. What is it?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I have been feeling stronger lately, more settled in my body and my mind. And I have been wondering if maybe, possibly, we might consider trying to have a baby. Together." Cole's expression was carefully neutral. "Are you sure? You said you did not think you could survive another loss." "I know what I said," Sarah replied, her hands twisting in her lap. And I have thought about this constantly, turned it over from every angle. The truth is, I am terrified. The idea of being pregnant again, of risking that kind of pain, makes me feel physically ill. But Cole, I also keep thinking about what you said about living meaning taking risks, about not letting fear make all our decisions. She turned to face him fully, her eyes earnest. I do not need a baby to be happy. You are right that our life together is complete as it is, but I also think that maybe, with you by my side, I could be brave enough to try one more time, not to replace the babies I lost because nothing could ever do that, but to embrace the possibility of new life, new love, new hope. Cole was quiet for a long moment, his expression serious. Sarah, I meant what I said. I do not need children to feel fulfilled. But if this is something you truly want, something you feel strong enough to pursue, then I will be with you every step of the way. We will face whatever comes together. Promise me something, Sarah said urgently, gripping his hands. Promise me that if the worst happens, if we lose another baby, you will not let me lose myself. Promise me you will pull me back from the darkness. Remind me why life is worth living. Force me to keep choosing to survive. I promise, Cole said solemnly, and Sarah, and I need you to promise me something too. Promise that you will not blame yourself if things go wrong. Promise that you will remember you are enough, baby or no baby, that your worth is not determined by your ability to carry a child to term. Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. I promise. They tried, and 3 months later, Sarah missed her monthly course. The confirmation of pregnancy brought a complicated rush of emotions, joy and terror, hope and dread, excitement and crushing fear, all swirled together until Sarah felt dizzy with it. Cole watched her carefully, ready to provide whatever support she needed, and they made a mutual decision to tell no one about the pregnancy until much later, protecting this fragile hope from outside scrutiny. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Sarah suffered severe morning sickness that lasted well into the 4th month, and she was constantly anxious, convinced that every twinge or pain signaled impending disaster. Cole was endlessly patient, holding her hair when she was sick, rubbing her back when she ached, talking her down from panic when fear threatened to overwhelm her. Dr. Holloway examined her regularly, his expression cautiously optimistic but non-committal. Everything looks as it should, he would say carefully, but we both know that is no guarantee. You must rest, eat well, and try not to worry excessively. Easier said than done. Sarah was terrified every single day, and only Cole's steady presence kept her from spiraling into complete panic. He talked to her belly at night, telling the baby stories and making promises about the life they would build together. He was careful not to be overly optimistic, not to make assumptions about outcomes, but his love for both Sarah and their unborn child was evident in every word and gesture. In her 7th month, Sarah woke in the middle of the night with sharp pains radiating through her abdomen. Cole was awake instantly, lighting a lamp and examining her with barely controlled fear. When the pains continued and Sarah began to bleed, Cole rode through the darkness to fetch Dr. Holloway, pushing his horse to dangerous speeds and praying to a God he was not sure he believed in. The doctor arrived and examined Sarah with grave efficiency. The baby is trying to come early, he said quietly. We need to try to stop the labor if we can. Give the child more time to develop. Mrs. Harrison, I need you to stay as still as possible, remain calm, and let me try some interventions. The next 36 hours were the longest of their lives. Dr. Holloway tried various remedies and techniques to halt the premature labor, and miraculously, the contractions eventually slowed and then stopped. Sarah was ordered to complete bed rest for the remainder of the pregnancy, and Cole hired a woman from town to help with household chores so he could focus on the ranch work and caring for Sarah. The final 2 months of pregnancy crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah lay in bed, her hands on her belly, feeling the baby move and trying to believe that this time might be different. Cole sat with her for hours, Reading aloud, playing cards, talking about everything and nothing. He never showed his own fear, never let Sarah see how terrified he was of losing both her and the baby, of watching her faith shatter all over again. When labor finally began in late October, nearly a year after their wedding, Sarah was gripped by terror so profound she could barely breathe. Cole held her hands and looked into her eyes with fierce determination. "You can do this," he said firmly. "You are the strongest person I have ever known, and you can do this. I am right here, Sarah. I am not going anywhere." Labor was long and difficult. Sarah was exhausted from months of anxiety and bed rest, and her body struggled with the demands being placed on it. Dr. Holloway worked with quiet competence, offering encouragement and guidance. But as the hours stretched on, worry began to show on his weathered face. "The baby is in distress," he said quietly during a brief lull. "We need to get this child out soon, or we may lose both mother and baby." Cole felt his blood turn to ice, but he forced himself to remain calm for Sarah's sake. "Tell us what to do," he said steadily. The doctor gave instructions, and for the next hour they worked together, Cole supporting Sarah, the doctor guiding the birth with skilled hands. Sarah pushed with everything she had, drawing on reserves of strength she did not know she possessed, fueled by desperation and the memory of 3 tiny graves that must not be joined by a 4th. And then just when Sarah felt she could not continue, when darkness crept at the edges of her vision and despair threatened to swallow her whole, there was a final tremendous effort, a searing pain, and then the sharp, piercing cry of a newborn baby. Sarah's eyes flew open, afraid to hope, afraid to believe. Dr. Holloway was holding a red, squirming infant, and the baby was crying loudly and vigorously, filling the room with the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. "A boy," the doctor said, his voice thick with emotion. "A healthy, strong boy." Cole was openly weeping, his hands shaking as the doctor placed the baby on Sarah's chest. Sarah looked down at her son, at his tiny face scrunched up in indignant complaint, at his perfect fingers grasping at air, at the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed deep, full breaths, and she felt something break open inside her. Not break like shattering, but break like dawn breaking, like spring breaking through winter's hold. "He is alive," she whispered, her voice full of wonder and disbelief. "Cole, he is alive. He is breathing." "He is perfect," Cole said, his hand gently touching the baby's downy head. "You did it, Sarah. You brought him here. You kept him safe. You did it." The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Dr. Holloway cleaned and examined the baby, pronouncing him robust and healthy despite being slightly small. Sarah, exhausted beyond measure, could not stop touching her son, counting his fingers and toes, watching the flutter of his eyelids, listening to the soft sounds he made. Cole refused to leave their side, sitting on the edge of the bed and marveling at the tiny life they had created together. "What should we name him?" Cole asked softly, his finger tracing the baby's miniature hand. Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. She thought about naming him after Thomas, her first husband, but that felt wrong somehow, like trying to resurrect the past rather than embracing the present. She thought about naming him after her father or Cole's brother, but neither felt quite right. "Joseph," she said finally, "Joseph Harrison. It means God will increase, and I think after all the loss, all the grief, he is a sign that life can increase again, that joy can return even after the darkest nights." "Joseph," Cole repeated, testing the name. "I love it." "Hello, Joseph. Welcome to the world, son. We have been waiting for you." The first weeks with Joseph were exhausting and exhilarating. Sarah barely slept, convinced that if she took her eyes off him for even a moment, something terrible would happen. She checked his breathing constantly, waking him unnecessarily just to hear him cry and confirm he was alive. Cole understood her fear, but he also gently encouraged her to rest, to trust that Joseph was strong and healthy. "He is not the others," Cole said gently one night when Sarah was hovering over the cradle for the 100th time. "He is his own person, Sarah, and he is thriving. You need to sleep to regain your strength, or you will make yourself sick." "I am just so afraid," Sarah admitted, her voice breaking. "I am afraid to love him too much, to believe he will stay, to let down my guard even for a moment." Cole wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they both looked down at their sleeping son. "I know," he said quietly, "but fear is no way to live, and it is no way to love. Joseph deserves a mother who can embrace joy, not one paralyzed by the possibility of loss. Trust me to share the watching, Sarah. Let me help carry this burden so you can actually enjoy being his mother." It took time, but gradually Sarah began to relax. Joseph continued to thrive, gaining weight and growing stronger every day. He was a contented baby, crying only when hungry or wet, and his eyes tracked his parents' movements with increasing awareness. When he smiled for the first time, a genuine, gummy smile directed at Sarah's face, she burst into tears and called for Cole, needing him to witness this miraculous moment. As winter settled over the ranch once more, the Harrison family established new rhythms and routines. Cole managed the ranch work, while Sarah cared for Joseph. And in the evenings they would sit together by the fire, passing the baby back and forth, marveling at every new development and milestone. Sarah was still sometimes gripped by fear, still had moments when the memories of her lost children brought fresh tears, but these moments were balanced now by genuine happiness, by the warm weight of Joseph in her arms, and the steady love of the man who had saved her from drowning in grief. One evening in February, with snow falling softly outside and Joseph sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Sarah and Cole sat together on the sofa, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Sarah asked quietly. "When you told me that the value of existence was in every sunrise, every breath, every moment I chose to keep living?" "I remember," Cole said, his arm tightening around her. "I did not believe you then," Sarah admitted. "I thought you were spouting empty platitudes, that you could not possibly understand the depth of my despair. But Cole, you were right. Every breath I took, even when it hurt, even when I wanted to give up, led me to this moment, to you, to Joseph, to a life I never imagined could exist after such devastating loss." She turned to look at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "You taught me that faith is not about believing in perfect outcomes or divine protection. It is about believing in the resilience of the human heart, in the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds, in the possibility of joy emerging from the ashes of tragedy." Cole's hand cupped her face tenderly. "You taught me just as much," he said. "You showed me that commitment means staying even when things are hard, that love is not just passion, but patience and steadiness, and choosing someone over and over again. You gave me a home, Sarah, not just a place, but a purpose, a reason to stop drifting and start building something real." They kissed soft and sweet, a reaffirmation of the bond that had been forged in the crucible of grief and tempered by time and trust. When they broke apart, Sarah glanced over at Joseph's cradle, and a thought occurred to her. "Cole, do you think we might want more children someday?" she asked tentatively. "Not right away, but maybe in a few years when Joseph is older?" Cole looked surprised, then thoughtful. "I would love to have more children with you," he said carefully, "but only if you truly want it, only if you feel strong enough to face that risk again." "I think I do," Sarah said slowly. "Not to replace the ones I lost, but to add to the family we are building, to give Joseph siblings, to fill this house with life and laughter, to prove that fear does not get the final word in our story." "Then we will," Cole agreed, kissing her forehead. "When the time is right, when you are ready, we will try again, together." The years that followed were not without challenges. The ranch faced droughts and harsh winters, cattle diseases, and fluctuating markets, but Sarah and Cole faced everything as partners, their bond strengthened by shared adversity and mutual respect. Joseph grew into a sturdy, curious toddler with his mother's brown eyes and his father's determined chin, and he brought constant joy and occasional chaos to their lives. When Joseph was 3 years old, Sarah became pregnant again. This time, while still anxious, she was not paralyzed by fear. She had learned to balance hope and realism, to protect herself emotionally while still allowing herself to dream. The pregnancy was easier than Joseph's had been, and though Sarah had some difficult days, overall she felt stronger and more confident. In the spring of 1880, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby girl they named Ruth, after Cole's mother. The birth was faster and less traumatic than Joseph's had been, and when Ruth was placed in Sarah's arms, squalling and pink-cheeked, Sarah felt a rush of pure, uncomplicated joy. Cole, holding Joseph so he could meet his new sister, looked at his wife with such profound love and pride that Sarah felt her heart might burst. 2 years later, another son arrived, whom they named Samuel. He was the easiest of the babies, both in birth and temperament, and his arrival felt like a final confirmation that their family was complete and blessed. Sarah sometimes thought about Margaret, Daniel, and James, the 3 babies who had not survived, and she honored their memory by telling Joseph, Ruth, and Samuel about the siblings who had come before, making sure they knew they were part of a larger family story that included both loss and triumph. By the time Samuel was walking and talking, the Mitchell Ranch, now firmly the Harrison Ranch, had become one of the most prosperous small operations in the county. Cole had proven to be an astute businessman as well as a skilled rancher, and Sarah managed the household and finances with capable efficiency. They hired several hands to help with the work, and they built a new addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family. One evening in the summer of 1883, as the sun set in brilliant colors across the Kansas prairie, Sarah stood on the porch watching her 3 children play in the yard. Joseph was 7 now, tall for his age, and serious like his father. Ruth was 3, all wild curls and infectious laughter. And Samuel, just 18 months old, toddled after his siblings with determined concentration. Cole came up behind Sarah and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. Sarah leaned back against him, secure in his embrace. "I am thinking about faith," she said quietly. "About how mine was completely shattered, broken into pieces I thought could never be repaired." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. "But you helped me build something new, Cole. Not the same faith I had before, because that innocence is gone forever, but something stronger, something that can withstand storms because it is founded on truth rather than naivety." "And what truth is that?" Cole asked, his eyes soft with love. "That suffering is real and loss is devastating, but so is love," Sarah said, her voice steady and sure. "That healing is possible even when you think you will never be whole again. That sometimes the greatest blessings come from the darkest places if you are brave enough to keep walking toward the light." She reached up to cup his face, her thumb tracing his cheekbone. "You held my hand when I was drowning in grief, Cole Harrison. You mourned beside my bed, and you refused to let me give up. You gave me time and space and patience and love, and you helped me find my way back to life." Cole's eyes were suspiciously bright. "You did the same for me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was a drifter with no roots, no home, no hope for something better. You gave me a purpose, a family, a reason to believe in forever." They kissed as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, their children's laughter providing a joyful soundtrack. When they broke apart, Joseph came running up to the porch. "Papa, Mama, come play with us, Itkis," he called, his face flushed and happy. "Samuel wants to ride the tire swing, but Ruth says she gets to go first." Cole laughed and swept Samuel up into his arms. "We had better referee before war breaks out," he said to Sarah, his eyes twinkling. Sarah took Ruth's small hand and followed her husband down the porch steps, her heart full to overflowing. She thought briefly of the woman she had been 7 years ago, broken and faithless, certain that joy was forever beyond her reach. That woman would scarcely recognize the life Sarah lived now, surrounded by love and laughter, blessed with children who were healthy and thriving, partnered with a man who had proven that true love meant showing up day after day, in the small and large moments alike. As the evening deepened and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the Harrison family remained outside, playing and talking and simply being together. Inside the house, the nursery that had once been a shrine to grief and loss had been transformed into a bright, cheerful room where Ruth and Samuel slept, their beds covered in quilts Sarah had sewn with her own hands, embroidered with patterns that told stories of hope and resilience. On the mantel in the parlor, alongside daguerreotypes of the living children, sat 3 small photographs in silver frames. They were images Sarah had commissioned from an artist, watercolor portraits of the babies she had lost, created from her descriptions since no photographs existed. Margaret, Daniel, and James were remembered and honored, their brief lives acknowledged as real and meaningful. But they no longer defined Sarah's existence or held her captive to grief. That night, after the children were finally bathed and tucked into bed, Sarah and Cole sat together on the porch in the rocking chairs they had bought to replace the single chair from the nursery. The night was warm and full of cricket song, and the air smelled of hay and wildflowers. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly, "taking a chance on a grief-stricken widow with a failing ranch?" "You could have had an easier life, Cole." Cole reached over and took her hand, that gesture that had become their signature, the physical manifestation of their bond. "Easier is not better," he said firmly. "I could have had 100 easier lives, Sarah, but none of them would have been as full, as meaningful, as rich as this one. You are my greatest adventure, my most profound blessing, and I would walk through that grief and pain 1,000 times if it meant ending up here, with you, with our children, with this life we have built together." Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with happy tears. "I love you, Cole Harrison. Thank you for saving me, for believing in me, for refusing to let me disappear into darkness." "I love you too, Sarah Harrison," Cole replied, his voice warm and sure. "Thank you for letting me stay, for teaching me what home means, for giving me a reason to believe in tomorrow." They sat in comfortable silence as the moon rose over the prairie, 2 people who had found each other in the midst of tragedy and built something beautiful from the ruins of broken dreams. Their story was not one of easy happiness or simple resolutions. It was a story of real grief and hard-won healing, of faith shattered and slowly rebuilt into something stronger, of love that proved itself not through grand gestures but through daily choice and steadfast presence. The ranch thrived, the children grew, and Sarah and Cole grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year, weathering storms and celebrating triumphs as partners in every sense of the word. When they eventually passed many years later, they were buried side by side on the ranch they had built together, their shared headstone engraved with words that told their story. Together they walked through darkness into light, and love made all the difference. And on warm summer evenings when the wind blew just right across the Kansas prairie, it seemed to carry echoes of laughter and love, a testimony to the enduring power of 2 wounded souls who had found healing in each other's arms and built a legacy that would endure for generations to come.